The massive crystalline dome of Station Nexus stretched impossibly far overhead, its walls alive with swirling patterns of light that represented the combined languages of 47 different species. Ambassador Elena Rodriguez walked through corridors that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, her simple black diplomatic bag clutched in one hand and a worn leather briefcase in the other. Her breath misted slightly in the thin atmosphere that the station maintained as a compromise between the atmospheric needs of carbon-based and silicon-based life forms. Elena had spent 3 months traveling here aboard the human vessel Persistence, a name that the other species found oddly prophetic given humanity's reputation for stubborn determination. The ship itself was a source of considerable amusement among the more advanced species, held together with what humans insisted on calling emergency repairs, and powered by what their engineers cheerfully described as barely controlled explosions. Yet somehow, impossibly, it had made the journey across 17 light-years without suffering the catastrophic failure that every alien engineer predicted. The council chambers themselves were an architectural marvel that defied several known laws of physics. The amphitheater was carved from a single piece of crystallized space-time, allowing beings from different temporal reference frames to participate in discussions without experiencing the usual paradoxes. Floating platforms accommodated the various atmospheric requirements of different species, from a methane-breathing Zorati to the plasma-form entities known as the Burning Ones. Elena paused at the entrance, taking in the sight of beings that represented the pinnacle of galactic civilization. The ancient keepers floated in their environmental suits, their crystalline forms refracting light in patterns that spoke of eons of accumulated wisdom. The insectoid hive queens communicated through complex pheromone signatures that painted elaborate chemical messages in the air around their platforms. In the deepest section of the chamber, something that might have been the avatar of a gas giant-sized intelligence observed through sensors that processed information across 17 different dimensional planes. "The human delegation will approach the speaking circle," announced a voice that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the chamber. The translation matrix worked overtime to convert the announcement into patterns that each species could comprehend: chemical signatures for the hive queens, electromagnetic pulses for the machine intelligences, and simple acoustic wave for the handful of species that still relied on such primitive communication methods. Elena walked forward, her footsteps echoing strangely in the vast space. She was acutely aware that she was probably the most primitive being in the chamber, representing a species that had only achieved faster-than-light travel within the last century, and whose idea of advanced computing still involved pushing electricity through specially arranged sand. Yet she carried herself with the quiet confidence that seemed to characterize humans in situations where they were clearly outmatched, a trait that several species had noted with growing unease. The speaking circle itself was a raised platform in the center of the chamber, surrounded by concentric rings of observation platforms. As Elena stepped onto the platform, she felt the subtle tingle of scanning beams, analyzing everything from her genetic structure to the quantum signatures of her clothing. The sensation was oddly reminiscent of the full-body scanners at airports back on Earth, though these were considerably more thorough and operated on principles that human science was only beginning to understand. "State your designation and purpose," came the formal request, this time in English with only the slightest accent that suggested the translation matrix was still learning human linguistic patterns. Ambassador Elena Rodriguez, representing the United Earth government and its associated colony worlds, Elena replied, her voice carrying clearly through the amplification systems. "I come before the Galactic Council to formally request membership for the human species and to present the military capabilities of our people as required by Article 7 of the Membership Accords." A ripple of interest moved through the assembled delegates. The formal presentation of military capabilities was typically a routine affair. Most species demonstrated some variant of energy weapons, showed off their defensive capabilities, perhaps exhibited their ability to coordinate large-scale fleet movements. It was considered something of a formality, as any species advanced enough to achieve galactic travel had presumably mastered the basic principles of applied violence. The eldest of the keepers, a being known as the First Memory, spoke in harmonics that made the crystalline walls of the chamber resonate sympathetically. The human delegation is recognized. We have reviewed your preliminary submissions regarding your species' technological development and military doctrine. Your achievements are interesting. There was something in the way the translation matrix rendered that final word that suggested the original concept was considerably more complex and possibly tinged with what humans might recognize as nervous amusement. Elena had spent enough time studying galactic diplomatic protocols to understand that interesting was often the polite way of saying completely insane but somehow effective. Your species appears to favor what you term kinetic weapons over more sophisticated energy-based systems, continued another voice, this one belonging to a HFY War form whose methane atmosphere glowed with bioluminescent patterns. Your military doctrine emphasizes what your files describe as controlled violence and maximum lethality with minimum resources. These concepts are unfamiliar to most galactic civilizations. Elena nodded, having expected this line of questioning. Human military philosophy was indeed unusual by galactic standards. Most advanced species had moved beyond crude kinetic weapons millennia ago, developing increasingly sophisticated energy-based systems that could disable rather than destroy, that could target specific molecular structures or disrupt electronic systems without causing unnecessary casualties. Humanity, by contrast, seemed to approach warfare with a directness that bordered on primitive. We have found that simple solutions often prove remarkably effective, Elena replied diplomatically. Our species has a saying, if something is worth doing, it's worth doing with unnecessary force. The translation of this concept caused a brief pause as the Matrix attempted to render unnecessary force into languages and thought patterns that had evolved past the concept of overkill. Several species exchanged communication bursts that Elena's briefings had taught her to recognize as expressions of concern. Very well, announced the First Memory. The Council will observe your military demonstration. Present your weapons for analysis and evaluation. This was the moment Elena had been preparing for during the entire journey to Station Nexus. She set down her briefcase and held up her simple black diplomatic bag, the kind that millions of humans carried to work every day without giving a second thought. Honored council members, before I begin the demonstration, I should mention that human weapons can be somewhat unconventional. Our military philosophy is based on the principle that anything can be a weapon if you approach it with sufficient creativity. Proceed with your demonstration, came the formal response, though Elena could detect what sounded like barely suppressed curiosity in some of the voices. After all, how dangerous could a simple bag possibly be? Elena smiled, and something about that expression caused several of the more perceptive species to begin powering up their personal defensive systems. She reached into the bag and withdrew what appeared to be nothing more than a standard emergency flare, the kind that human spacecraft carried by the thousands. This is a Class C emergency signaling device, standard equipment on all human vessels, completely harmless under normal circumstances. She paused, letting the council examine the unremarkable cylinder through their various scanning systems. The readings confirmed what the object appeared to be, a simple chemical flare containing magnesium and oxidizer, designed to burn brightly for approximately 10 minutes in vacuum conditions. However, Elena continued, her smile becoming somewhat more pronounced, humans have discovered that when you remove the timing mechanism and replace it with a pressure-sensitive trigger, and then supplement the standard chemical mixture with a small amount of powdered aluminum and crystallized oxygen. She trailed off as she made a subtle adjustment to the device. The station's threat assessment systems, which had been running continuous scans since Elena entered the chamber, suddenly began processing information that didn't quite make sense. The simple emergency flare in the human's hand was registering energy signatures that suggested it was no longer quite as harmless as it had initially appeared. The result, Elena said cheerfully, is what our military engineers classify as an improvised incendiary device capable of burning through approximately 30 centimeters of standard starship hull plating. Completely legal to carry under galactic shipping regulations because technically it's still just an emergency flare. The collective intake of breath from 47 different species created a sound unlike anything heard in the council chambers for several centuries. The Zorati delegates' bioluminescent patterns shifted into what Elena recognized as expressions of alarm, while several machine intelligences began running rapid probability calculations on exactly how many emergency flares the human ship had brought with them. But Elena was just getting started. She reached back in her bag and withdrew a standard datapad, the kind used for routine diplomatic correspondence. This is a standard information processing device. Every member of our delegation carries one. Completely unremarkable piece of technology. The scanning systems confirmed this assessment, detecting nothing more than standard computing components and a modest power supply. Elena turned the device over in her hands, pointing out various features with the casual manner of someone discussing the weather. What makes it interesting from a military perspective, she continued, is that the power cell contains enough stored energy to run the device for approximately 72 hours of continuous operation. However, if you bypass the standard power regulation circuits and discharge that energy over the course of, say, 3 seconds, she made another subtle adjustment to the device, and suddenly, the station's sensors were registering what could only be described as a potential electromagnetic pulse weapon of considerable sophistication. The fact that it was disguised as a routine piece of diplomatic equipment was causing several alien security systems to register levels of concern that bordered on panic. The resulting electromagnetic discharge can disable most standard electronic systems within a radius of approximately 50 meters. Elena explained with the same cheerful tone she might use to describe her favorite recipe. We classify it as a non-lethal area denial weapon, though I understand that some species might find the temporary disruption of their cybernetic life support systems to be somewhat inconvenient. The chamber had grown remarkably quiet as the full implications of what Elena was demonstrating began to sink in. These weren't exotic weapons requiring rare materials or advanced manufacturing techniques. These were common, everyday items that any civilian could carry without attracting attention, modified with nothing more than basic technical knowledge and what humans apparently considered a bit of creative thinking. Elena reached into her bag again, this time withdrawing what appeared to be a simple writing instrument. Standard documentation stylus. Retractable titanium tip, pressurized ink reservoir, completely unremarkable in every way. The council watched with growing apprehension as Elena demonstrated the perfectly ordinary nature of what was obviously not going to remain a perfectly ordinary writing instrument for much longer. The interesting thing about pressurized systems, Elena continued conversationally, is that pressure can be increased well beyond normal operating parameters. When you combine that with a titanium penetrator and add a small charge to the rear chamber. She didn't need to finish the explanation. The scanning systems were already registering the fact that the human ambassador was now holding what amounted to a miniature rail gun capable of firing a titanium projectile with enough force to penetrate most personal armor systems. The projectile itself would be small enough to avoid detection by most security systems, and the weapon was disguised as something so mundane that no reasonable security protocol would think to confiscate it. The effective range is only about 10 meters, Elena admitted with what sounded like genuine disappointment. But the penetration capability is quite impressive. Our military designated it as a last resort personal defense weapon, though it's also quite effective for emergency hull repairs when you need to drive a sealing bolt through damaged plating. By this point, several species were beginning to understand that they weren't witnessing a conventional weapons demonstration. This was something far more unsettling, a glimpse into a mindset that viewed the entire universe as a potential armory. Every human tool, every piece of equipment, every seemingly innocent device carried the potential to become an instrument of destruction in the hands of someone who approached problems with sufficient creativity and a disturbing lack of conventional safety considerations. Elena reached for her bag again, and the collective tension in the chamber reached levels that would have been measurable with standard atmospheric sensors. Now, you might be wondering about larger-scale applications of this philosophy, she said, apparently oblivious to the fact that several delegates had begun quietly powering up their defensive systems. For example, she continued, withdrawing what appeared to be a standard food ration bar. This is emergency sustenance, designed to provide optimal nutrition for human metabolism during extended space travel. Shelf-stable, portable, and, according to most humans, nearly inedible under normal circumstances. The food bar registered as exactly what it appeared to be: processed nutrients held together with edible binding agents and wrapped in standard packaging material. Nothing remotely threatening about it. Elena began unwrapping the bar with the careful attention of someone performing a delicate technical procedure. The binding agents used in food preservation share certain chemical properties with materials used in mining operations. When you modify the mixture ratios and add a few common chemical catalysts, most of which can be found in standard medical supplies, the result is what our engineers classify as a plastic explosive. The chamber fell completely silent as the implications hit home. Food. They were talking about weaponizing food. The stuff that every sentient being carried routinely, that passed through security checkpoints without a second glance, that was stored by the ton on every space vessel and orbital facility in the galaxy. The explosive yield is modest, Elena admitted, but sufficient for most demolition requirements. And since it's technically still food, it remains completely legal to transport and store in large quantities. In fact, I believe our ship is carrying approximately 2 tons of these emergency rations. Several delegates began rapid calculations of exactly how much potential explosive material was currently docked at their supposedly secure station, disguised as perfectly innocent emergency supplies. The numbers were not reassuring, but Elena still wasn't finished. She reached in her bag once more and withdrew something that caused every security system in the station to suddenly focus its attention with laser-like intensity. It was a small glass vial containing what appeared to be ordinary water. This, Elena said, holding up the vial, is probably our most versatile military asset. Water. She was talking about water as a military asset. The translation systems struggled with this concept, eventually settling on interpretations that range from liquid ammunition to strategic hydration device. Water is remarkably useful. Elena continued with the enthusiasm of someone discussing a favorite hobby. It's available on virtually every inhabitable world. It's completely innocuous. In fact, most security systems are designed to ignore it entirely. And yet, with just a few simple modifications to its molecular structure. She paused, allowing the suspense to build while the scanning systems performed increasingly frantic analyses of the simple glass vial in her hand. Deuterium oxide. Heavy water. When properly utilized in conjunction with certain fissile materials that can be extracted from standard Starship reactor shielding using nothing more than kitchen chemistry. Elena didn't need to finish that sentence. The concept of weaponizing the most common substance in the galaxy was so fundamentally disturbing that several species experienced the psychological equivalent of system crashes as their worldviews attempted to process the information. The first memory spoke, its harmonics carrying undertones of the translation matrix rendered as carefully controlled horror. Ambassador Rodriguez, are you suggesting that your species is weaponized? Everything? Elena considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Not everything, she replied thoughtfully. We haven't figured out how to weaponize music yet, though our military researchers are reportedly making progress on that front. And we've had limited success with weaponized poetry, though that's considered somewhat inhumane even by our standards. She paused, then brightened considerably. But, yes, our general philosophy is that any object, substance, or phenomenon can potentially be turned into a weapon given sufficient motivation and creative application of scientific principles. We find it's a useful way of thinking about problem solving in general. The chamber remained silent as the assembled representatives of galactic civilization tried to process what they had just learned. They had expected a routine demonstration of military hardware. Instead, they had received a comprehensive education in applied creative destruction that called into question everything they thought they knew about security, safety, and the fundamental nature of civilization itself. Elena began placing her items back into her bag with the same casual efficiency she had used to remove them. Of course, this is just a small sampling of our capabilities. If the Council would like a more comprehensive demonstration, I'd be happy to show you what we can do with really dangerous items. Such as, asked the Zorati delegate, though the bioluminescent patterns around its atmospheric suit suggested it was already regretting the question. Elena's smile returned, and somehow it managed to be even more unsettling than before. Well, I do happen to have some actual weapons in my other bag. The silence that followed Elena's casual mention of actual weapons stretched far longer than any translation delay could account for. 47 different species, representing some of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy, found themselves collectively holding their breath as they contemplated what someone with humanity's creative approach to violence might consider to be an actual weapon. Elena noticed the reaction and tilted her head slightly, an expression of mild confusion crossing her features. Is there a problem? The preliminary diplomatic notes indicated that weapons demonstrations were standard procedure for membership applications. The first memory's harmonics carried undertones that suggested careful recalibration of threat assessment protocols. Ambassador Rodriguez, the weapons demonstrations we typically observe involve conventional armaments, energy projection devices, defensive field generators, perhaps orbital bombardment capabilities for species with particularly aggressive tendencies. Oh, Elena said, her expression brightening with understanding. You want to see the boring stuff first. That makes sense from a procedural standpoint, I suppose. She set down her diplomatic bag and opened her leather briefcase with the practiced efficiency of someone accessing frequently used tools. The scanning systems immediately focused on the contents, revealing an array of objects that appear to be nothing more than standard diplomatic and personal items, which, given what they had just witnessed, was somehow more alarming than if the briefcase had been filled with obviously dangerous weapons. This is a standard-issue human sidearm, Elena announced, withdrawing what appeared to be an antique projectile weapon. The device looked almost primitive by galactic standards, a simple metal construction with mechanical moving parts and chemical propellant systems. The kind of weapon that most advanced species had abandoned millennia ago in favor of more sophisticated energy-based alternatives. The Zorati delegate's bioluminescence shifted into patterns that Elena's briefings had taught her to recognize as polite skepticism. Ambassador, with respect to your species' technological development, kinetic projectile weapons are considered somewhat archaic by galactic standards. Most modern defensive systems can easily defeat such simple armaments. Elena nodded agreeably. That's what we thought you'd think. It's also why this particular sidearm fires projectiles made from compressed dark matter. The chamber's atmosphere processors created a soft whooshing sound as several species involuntarily expelled whatever gases they used for respiration. Dark matter weaponization was theoretically possible, but the energy requirements and containment challenges had kept it firmly in the realm of theoretical speculation for most civilizations. The fact that humans had apparently miniaturized the technology into a personal weapon was causing several alien physicists to question their understanding of fundamental universal constants. The projectiles themselves are quite small, Elena continued conversationally, as if she were discussing the weather rather than describing weapons that violated several laws of physics. Only about 10 milligrams each. But, given the gravitational effects of compressed dark matter, each round effectively impacts with the kinetic energy equivalent of a small asteroid. She held up a standard ammunition magazine, allowing the scanning systems to confirm what their readings were already telling them. Each projectile contained matter that technically shouldn't exist in a stable form outside of specialized laboratory conditions, compressed into a configuration that generated localized gravitational anomalies. The effective range is limited to about 2 kilometers due to gravitational decay, Elena admitted with what sounded like genuine disappointment. And you can only fire about 3 rounds before the barrel begins to experience structural failure from repeated gravitational stress. But for stopping power, it's quite effective against most forms of matter. The machine intelligence, known as Logic Core 7, spoke for the first time, its electronic voice carrying harmonics that suggested rapid recalculation of probability matrices. Ambassador, our analysis indicates that your sidearm could potentially damage the structural integrity of this station with a single discharge. Elena paused, looking genuinely surprised. Really? Huh. The safety documentation said it was rated for shipboard use. Though I suppose that was assuming human standard construction materials. She carefully pointed the weapon away from any critical-looking areas. Good thing I mentioned it. Human safety protocols tend to assume that everyone builds things the way we do. How do humans build things? Asked the first memory, though its harmonics suggested it might be regretting the question even as it asked it. Redundantly, Elena replied promptly. Our standard practice is to build everything at least 3 times stronger than it needs to be, then add additional safety margins because something unexpected always goes wrong. We assume that any system will eventually fail in the most inconvenient way possible, so we design everything to fail safely. She gestured toward the weapon in her hands. For example, this sidearm is designed to remain functional even if the dark matter containment system experiences a catastrophic failure. The backup containment uses a different physical principle entirely, and the tertiary system just vents the dark matter in a hyperspace if everything else goes wrong. The concept of failure-friendly dark matter weaponry was causing several species to experience the philosophical equivalent of stack overflow errors. Most advanced civilizations approached exotic matter with extreme caution, using multiple redundant safety systems and fail-safe mechanisms that would shut down operations at the first sign of instability. Humans appear to have designed their systems with the assumption that catastrophic failure was not just possible, but inevitable, and had planned accordingly. May I ask what your military engineers consider to be proper safety margins for such devices? Inquired a new voice, belonging to one of the crystalline consciousness entities whose thought patterns operated on geological timescales. Elena considered the question carefully. For personal weapons? Usually about 50% above minimum operational requirements. For ship-mounted systems, we generally aim for double redundancy. For planetary defense installations, we build everything to withstand direct assault by our own weapon systems, because history has taught us that our own equipment has a disturbing tendency to be captured and used against us. And for strategic weapons? Asked the crystalline entity, though the harmonic undertones suggested it might not want to know the answer. Strategic weapons are built assuming that someone will eventually try to destroy them using other strategic weapons. Elena replied matter-of-factly. So we design them to remain functional even under those conditions. The theory is that if you're going to build a weapon capable of destroying planets, you should probably make sure it can survive having planets destroyed around it. The implications of this design philosophy were staggering. Most species built their most powerful weapons with the assumption that they would be used from safe distances under controlled conditions. Humans apparently built their strategic weapons with the assumption that they would be deployed in the middle of active combat zones against enemies using equivalent technology. Elena returned the sidearm to her briefcase and withdrew what appeared to be a simple communication device. This is a standard diplomatic communicator. It allows real-time translation between human languages and Galactic Standard, maintains encrypted communication links with our home systems, and provides basic computational support for diplomatic negotiations. The device registered as exactly what it appeared to be, though several scanning systems noted that its computational architecture was unusually robust for such a simple function. Elena activated the device, causing a small holographic display to appear above her hand, showing various diplomatic communication protocols. The interesting feature, Elena continued, is the communication laser. In order to maintain contact with human space across galactic distances, it operates at significantly higher power levels than most species require for similar functions. She made a subtle adjustment to the device's settings, and suddenly, the chamber's optical sensors were registering energy levels that suggested this simple communication device was capable of generating laser pulses in the terawatt range. The communication beam can be focused to a point source and fired in rapid pulses, Elena explained with the casual tone of someone discussing technical specifications. The result is what our military classifies as a precision energy weapon capable of engaging targets at interstellar ranges. Useful for disabling enemy sensors or communication arrays without causing significant collateral damage. The concept of weaponizing communication equipment struck several species as particularly disturbing, as it called into question the safety of any kind of technological interaction with humans. If they could turn routine diplomatic equipment into precision weapons, what else might they have modified without bothering to mention it? Of course, Elena added thoughtfully, the power requirements mean you can only fire it a few times before the power cell is depleted. But since it's still a functional communicator, nobody thinks twice about the unusual power consumption. She placed the communicator back in her briefcase and withdrew what looked like a simple medical scanner, the kind used for routine health monitoring during space travel. Standard biomedical analysis device, capable of performing detailed scans of biological systems, monitoring vital functions, and diagnosing medical conditions across a wide range of species. The medical scanner registered as completely legitimate, showing all the characteristics of advanced but unremarkable medical technology. Elena activated it, causing the device to emit a soft humming sound as its sensors began analyzing the various life forms in the chamber. Medical scanners work by analyzing biological systems at the molecular level, Elena explained, moving the device in a slow sweep across the assembled delegates. They identify specific biological markers, analyze genetic structures, and can even detect the presence of toxins or pathogens in living tissue. Several species began to realize where this explanation was heading and started activating personal defensive systems with varying degrees of subtlety. Elena either didn't notice or chose to ignore the rising level of alarm among her audience. The same scanning technology that can detect toxins can also be programmed to target specific biological markers for elimination, she continued. With a few software modifications and an increase in power output, the scanner can emit focused radiation pulses designed to disrupt specific molecular structures. She held up the scanner, now registering energy signatures that suggested it was capable of delivering precisely targeted doses of radiation that could selectively destroy specific types of biological tissue while leaving others unharmed. The effective range is limited to about 30 meters, Elena admitted, but the precision is remarkable. You can target specific organs, disrupt particular biological processes, or even eliminate specific genetic markers while leaving the rest of the organism unharmed. Our medical corps classifies it as a non-lethal precision weapon, though I suppose the distinction between non-lethal and selectively harmful might be somewhat academic, depending on your perspective. The medical implications alone were enough to cause widespread concern among the biological species present. But the military applications were causing even the machine intelligences to run rapid threat assessment calculations. A weapon that could selectively target specific biological systems could potentially be programmed to affect entire species while leaving others completely unharmed. Elena noticed the increasing agitation among the assembled delegates and frowned slightly. I should probably mention that all of our equipment comes with comprehensive safety protocols. We don't just hand out weaponized medical scanners without proper training. What constitutes proper training in human military doctrine? Asked the Zorti delegate, its bioluminescent patterns cycling through what Elena recognized as stress indicators. Oh, the usual things, Elena replied cheerfully. Basic equipment operation, safety procedures, creative problem-solving techniques, and advanced applications of controlled violence in confined spaces. Most humans complete the basic course during their mandatory education period. The concept of mandatory military training for the entire population was another distinctly human characteristic that set them apart from most galactic civilizations. Most advanced species had moved beyond the need for widespread military preparedness, relying on specialized military castes or automated defense systems. Humans apparently considered basic combat training to be a fundamental life skill, like mathematics or language comprehension. At what age do humans begin this military education? Asked the crystalline entity, its thought patterns shifting into configurations that suggested deep concern for human child welfare. Around age 12, Elena replied. We start with basic principles, situational awareness, threat assessment, improvised weapons construction, and emergency medical treatment. The advanced courses in exotic weapons handling and strategic thinking don't begin until age 16. The idea of 12-year-old humans learning improvised weapons construction was causing several species to experience what their psychologists would later classify as existential horror. Most galactic civilizations went to great lengths to protect their young from any exposure to violence, viewing childhood as a sacred period of innocence and development. Humans apparently viewed it as basic preparation for adult life. Elena reached for her briefcase again and withdrew what appeared to be a standard personal grooming kit. This is a basic hygiene maintenance system, standard equipment for any extended space travel. Contains everything necessary for personal cleanliness and health maintenance during long journeys. The grooming kit registered as exactly what it appeared to be: soap, cleaning implements, basic medical supplies, and various personal care items. Nothing that could possibly be considered threatening under any reasonable definition of the term. Personal hygiene is extremely important during extended space operations, Elena explained, opening the kit to display its contents. Confined spaces, recycled atmosphere, and limited water supplies create conditions where proper sanitation becomes a survival necessity. She picked up what appeared to be a standard bar of soap, holding it up for the scanning systems to analyze. This is basic cleansing compound, designed to remove dirt, grease, and biological contaminants from human skin and clothing. The soap registered as completely harmless, a simple mixture of surfactants and cleaning agents that would be familiar to any species that had developed basic chemistry. Elena turned it over in her hands, pointing out various features with the same casual manner she had used for everything else. The interesting thing about soap, she continued, is that the chemical compounds used for cleaning share certain properties with materials used in chemical manufacturing. When you concentrate the active ingredients and add a few catalytic agents. She made a subtle gesture, and suddenly, the scanning systems were registering the fact that the innocent bar of soap in the human's hand contained the chemical precursors for what could best be described as a contact toxin of remarkable effectiveness. The soap remains completely functional for its intended purpose, Elena explained helpfully. In fact, it works better than standard soap because of the enhanced chemical activity. But it also provides an excellent delivery system for a wide range of chemical agents that can be absorbed through skin contact. The implications were staggering. Every human who had ever visited a galactic facility had presumably carried similar personal care items, all of which could potentially have been modified into chemical weapons without arousing the slightest suspicion from security systems designed to detect actual weapons rather than weaponized hygiene products. The effective dosage is quite small, Elena continued, and the symptoms can be delayed for several hours, which makes it ideal for situations where immediate detection would be problematic. Our intelligence services classify it as a stealth weapon for use in social environments where conventional weapons would be inappropriate. She carefully rewrapped the soap and placed it back in the grooming kit with the same casual efficiency she had used throughout the demonstration. Of course, this is all theoretical from a diplomatic standpoint. The actual deployment of chemical weapons is strictly prohibited under galactic law, and humanity has no intention of violating those agreements. The careful legal distinction between possession of chemical weapon precursors and deployment of actual chemical weapons was lost on no one in the chamber. Elena had just demonstrated that humans routinely carried the materials and knowledge necessary to violate some of the galaxy's most fundamental laws, while maintaining technical compliance with all applicable regulations. Ambassador Rodriguez spoke the first memory, its harmonics carrying undertones of carefully controlled alarm. Are you suggesting that every human civilian is potentially carrying chemical weapons disguised as personal care items? Elena considered the question with apparent seriousness. Not every human, she replied thoughtfully. Some prefer mechanical approaches to problem solving. And our children aren't allowed to carry the really dangerous stuff until they complete their advanced training. The distinction between really dangerous stuff and the weapon she had already demonstrated was not particularly comforting to anyone present. If this was what humans considered routine personal equipment, the implications for what they might consider actually dangerous were causing widespread system failures among the various threat assessment protocols operating throughout the station. Elena reached for her briefcase once more and withdrew what appeared to be a simple writing pad, the kind used for taking notes during meetings and diplomatic sessions. This is a standard documentation system, paper-based information storage using graphite marking implements. The writing pad registered as completely benign, processed plant fiber with carbon-based marking materials, about as far from threatening as any object could possibly be. Elena opened the pad, revealing pages covered with handwritten notes in what appeared to be standard diplomatic shorthand. Humans still use physical documentation systems for certain applications, Elena explained, flipping through the pages. We find that paper-based records are immune to electromagnetic interference, can't be hacked remotely, and don't require power sources or maintenance. She held up one of the pencils that came with the pad, allowing the scanning systems to confirm that it was indeed nothing more than graphite and wood. The interesting thing about graphite, she continued, is that it's essentially a form of carbon arranged in a specific crystalline structure. With the right chemical treatment, you can modify that structure to create what we call programmable carbon. Elena made a subtle motion with the pencil, and suddenly, the scanning systems were detecting trace amounts of materials that suggested the simple writing implement contained nanotechnological components of considerable sophistication. Programmable carbon can be designed to undergo specific chemical reactions when exposed to certain environmental conditions, Elena explained, sketching a simple diagram on the paper. Temperature, humidity, chemical exposure, even specific electromagnetic frequencies can trigger pre-programmed reactions. She finished her sketch, a simple diagram of molecular structures that several species recognized as representing some form of nanotechnological weapon system. The fact that she had drawn it using the very materials she was describing was either an impressive demonstration of confidence or a subtle threat, depending on one's perspective. The applications are quite varied, Elena continued, apparently oblivious to the growing alarm among her audience. You can create delayed reaction explosives, targeted toxins, or even self-replicating systems that can perform specific tasks when activated. The concept of self-replicating nanotechnological weapons was something that most galactic civilizations had classified as a potential existential threat. The fact that humans had apparently miniaturized the technology into everyday writing materials suggested a level of casual expertise with exotic technologies that was deeply unsettling. Of course, Elena added thoughtfully, the programming is quite complex, and the manufacturing requirements are substantial. It's not the sort of thing you'd want to mass produce without proper safety protocols. She closed the writing pad and placed it back in her briefcase with the same casual efficiency she had used for everything else. But it's useful for situations where you need to deploy sophisticated systems without attracting attention from security scanners that are designed to detect conventional weapons. The chamber had fallen into the kind of profound silence that usually preceded either enlightenment or catastrophe. Elena looked around at the assembled delegates with an expression of mild concern, as if she were beginning to suspect that her demonstration might not be proceeding according to standard protocols. "Is there something wrong?" she asked. "I was told that weapons demonstrations were routine for membership applications. Have I misunderstood the requirements?" The first memory spoke, its harmonics carrying undertones that suggested fundamental recalibration of galactic diplomatic procedures. Ambassador Rodriguez, the weapons you have demonstrated are unprecedented in their scope and creativity. Most species present conventional military equipment, energy weapons, defensive systems, perhaps orbital bombardment capabilities. Oh, Elena said, her expression brightening with understanding. You want to see the conventional stuff, too. That makes sense. I suppose I should have started with the obvious things. She reached for her other bag, the one she had identified earlier as containing actual weapons, and paused. Should I proceed, or would you prefer to take a break first? Some of our conventional weapon systems have fairly dramatic demonstration requirements, and I'd hate to cause any unintended damage to the station. The offer of a break was met with what could generously be described as enthusiastic acceptance. While Elena waited patiently in the speaking circle, the assembled representatives of galactic civilization engaged in the kind of rapid, multi-layered communication exchange that typically preceded either major diplomatic breakthroughs or declarations of war. The fact that they couldn't decide which category this situation fell into was itself a source of considerable discussion. The Zorati delegation had activated what appeared to be every defensive system at their disposal, creating a localized aurora of protective energy fields that made their section of the chamber look like a miniature nebula. The crystalline entities had shifted into higher dimensional configurations that allowed them to observe the proceedings from several temporal reference points simultaneously, presumably in case they needed to evacuate to an alternate timeline at short notice. Most disturbing of all, the machine intelligences had begun what could only be described as an emergency software update, rapidly downloading and installing new threat assessment protocols that could account for weaponized soap and militarized writing utensils. The fact that LogicCore 7 had requested technical specifications for human child safety equipment suggested that the artificial minds were struggling to process concepts that fell completely outside their operational parameters. Elena, meanwhile, had taken out her writing pad and appeared to be making notes on the proceedings, occasionally glancing up at the various defensive preparations with the kind of professional interest that suggested she was mentally cataloging the effectiveness of alien security measures. Several delegates found this casual assessment of their protective systems to be almost as unnerving as the weapons demonstration itself. After approximately 20 minutes of what diplomatic protocols classified as emergency consultation, the first memory's harmonics resumed their formal cadence. Ambassador Rodriguez, the Council has concluded its preliminary discussion. We are prepared to continue with your demonstration, though we would appreciate advance warning if any of your conventional weapons systems pose a threat to station structural integrity. Elena looked up from her notes with an expression of mild surprise. Oh, you shouldn't worry about structural damage. Human weapons are designed with proper safety considerations in mind. We always ensure that our demonstration protocols account for environmental constraints and innocent bystanders. This assurance might have been more comforting if everyone present hadn't just witnessed her casual discussion of improvised explosives and nanotechnological weapons. The distinction between safe for demonstration purposes and safe in any absolute sense was apparently a fine one in human military doctrine. Elena set down her writing pad and opened her second bag with the same methodical care that a bomb disposal technician might use when handling unexploded ordnance, which, given what they had learned about human approaches to everyday items, might not have been an inappropriate comparison. This is a standard human military sidearm, Elena announced, withdrawing what appeared to be a much more conventional weapon than her first demonstration. The device looked reassuringly familiar, a sleek energy projection system that most species would recognize as an advanced but unremarkable directed energy weapon. The scanning systems confirmed this initial assessment, detecting power cells, focusing arrays, and emission chambers that all corresponded to known technologies. Several delegates felt the first stirrings of relief as they contemplated the possibility that human military equipment might actually conform to recognizable engineering principles. The power output is adjustable across 17 different settings, Elena explained, manipulating various controls on the weapon with practiced familiarity. From low-power stunning charges suitable for crowd control up to maximum output for anti-armor applications. She aimed the weapon at an empty section of the chamber and activated what appeared to be a harmless demonstration mode. A small holographic target materialized in the space, and Elena fired a brief pulse of energy that caused the target to flash and disappear. The display was impressive, but entirely conventional. Exactly the sort of thing that most species demonstrated during routine weapons evaluations. The effective range is approximately 800 meters in standard atmospheric conditions, Elena continued, with decreased effectiveness in vacuum due to energy dispersion. Rate of fire is limited by charging cycles, but the weapon can maintain sustained fire for approximately 40 minutes before requiring power cell replacement. The Zora T delegate's bioluminescent patterns shifted into configurations that suggested cautious optimism. This appears to be a conventional energy weapon system. The specifications are impressive, but within expected parameters for advanced military technology. Elena nodded agreeably. Yes, this is our standard issue energy weapon. Very reliable, easy to maintain, and effective against most known armor systems. She paused, then added with the same casual tone she had used throughout the demonstration, "Of course, that's just the basic configuration." The moment of relief that had been spreading through the chamber died abruptly, as every delegate remembered that humans apparently considered basic configuration to be merely a starting point for creative modification. The interesting thing about modular weapon systems, Elena continued, reaching into her bag for what appeared to be a small attachment device, is that they can be adapted for specialized applications depending on mission requirements. She connected the attachment to her energy weapon with a series of precise mechanical movements that spoke of extensive practice with the procedure. The scanning systems immediately registered that the weapon's energy output characteristics had changed dramatically, though the exact nature of those changes was unclear. This is a dimensional focusing array, Elena explained helpfully. It modifies the weapon's energy output to operate across multiple dimensional phases simultaneously. The concept of multidimensional weapons was something that most species had encountered only in theoretical physics papers and nightmare scenarios developed by strategic planners with overactive imaginations. The fact that humans had apparently miniaturized the technology into a portable attachment suggested a level of expertise with exotic physics that was causing several alien scientists to question their fundamental understanding of reality. The effective result, Elena continued, adjusting the weapon's settings with the casual competence of someone performing a routine technical procedure, is that the energy pulse impacts the target across several dimensional phases at once. Conventional armor systems only provide protection in normal space-time, so they're largely ineffective against multidimensional attacks. She fired another demonstration shot at a new holographic target, and this time the energy pulse appeared to flicker briefly out of existence before reappearing and striking the target from what appeared to be several different angles simultaneously. The visual effect was disorienting enough to cause several species to experience the psychological equivalent of motion sickness. The targeting is somewhat more complex, Elena admitted, because you have to account for dimensional drift and phase variance. But once you get used to the calculations, it's quite effective for engaging targets that rely on conventional defensive systems. The implications were staggering. Most galactic defensive technologies were based on the assumption that attacks would come from predictable directions in normal space-time. Weapons that could attack from alternate dimensional phases rendered most known defensive systems completely obsolete. Elena detached the dimensional focusing array and replaced it with another device that appeared to be significantly more complex, involving crystalline components and what looked like miniaturized gravitational field generators. "This is a temporal displacement module," she announced, causing several delegates to begin questioning whether they were still experiencing events in proper chronological order. Temporal weapons are somewhat controversial, Elena acknowledged, because of the potential for causality violations and paradox generation. but when properly calibrated, they can be quite useful for engaging targets that rely on precognitive defense systems or temporal shielding. The scanning systems were now registering energy signatures that suggested the weapon could fire projectiles that traveled backward through time to strike targets before the trigger was pulled. Several machine intelligences began experiencing what could best be described as logical recursion errors as they attempted to model the tactical implications. The temporal displacement is quite modest, Elena explained reassuringly. Only about 3 seconds, which is enough to bypass most reaction-based defenses, but not sufficient to create significant paradox risk. Our theoretical physicists have assured us that the probability of timeline bifurcation is less than 12% per discharge. The casual acceptance of a 12% chance of accidentally creating alternate timelines with each weapon's discharge was causing widespread philosophical crisis among species that considered temporal integrity to be one of the fundamental constants of existence. The fact that human military engineers apparently considered this to be an acceptable risk margin suggested an approach to causality that bordered on cavalier. Elena fired another demonstration shot, and this time the energy pulse appeared to impact the target slightly before the weapon's firing sequence was complete, creating a brief visual effect that caused several observers to experience temporal disorientation. The fact that she had just demonstrated a weapon that violated the basic principle of cause and effect was somehow less surprising than it should have been, given what they had already witnessed. Of course, Elena added thoughtfully, temporal weapons require special licensing and training certification. We don't allow just anyone to carry equipment that can accidentally rewrite history. The distinction between special licensing and freely available to trained personnel was not particularly comforting, especially given that Elena had previously mentioned that all humans received basic military training during their childhood education. The possibility that time-traveling weapons were considered standard equipment for properly licensed human civilians was causing several species to reconsider their understanding of civilizational development. Elena detached the temporal module and replaced it with what appeared to be a relatively simple crystalline attachment that hummed with barely audible energy signatures. "This is a consciousness disruption array," she announced, causing every sentient being in the chamber to suddenly become acutely aware of their own thought processes. Consciousness-based weapons are quite specialized, Elena explained, adjusting settings on what appeared to be a device designed to attack the fundamental nature of self-awareness itself. They're primarily effective against species that rely on collective consciousness, hive minds, or distributed intelligence networks. The scanning systems registered energy patterns that suggested the weapon could generate focused electromagnetic pulses designed to disrupt neural activity across a wide range of biological and artificial consciousness types. The fact that humans had developed weapons specifically designed to attack the concept of thought itself was causing several delegates to experience existential doubt about the nature of their own awareness. The effect is usually temporary, Elena added helpfully, though prolonged exposure can cause permanent alterations to personality structure and memory formation. Our psychological warfare specialists classify it as a non-lethal approach to enemy neutralization, though the definition of non-lethal becomes somewhat philosophical when you're discussing weapons that can erase someone's sense of self. She fired a brief, low-power demonstration pulse that caused every artificial intelligence in the chamber to experience momentary uncertainty about their own operational parameters. Even the biological species reported strange sensations, brief moments of disconnection from their own thought processes that were deeply unsettling. The targeting can be quite precise, Elena continued, apparently unaware of the psychological distress she was causing among her audience. You can selectively disrupt specific cognitive functions while leaving others intact. Memory formation, emotional processing, logical reasoning, sensory integration, all of these can be individually targeted depending on mission requirements. The concept of weapons that could selectively edit someone's mental capabilities was horrifying enough, but the casual way Elena discussed mission requirements for consciousness modification suggested that humans had given considerable thought to the tactical applications of psychological warfare at the most fundamental level. Elena removed the consciousness disruption array and replaced it with yet another attachment, this one involving what appear to be exotic matter containment systems and energy patterns that seem to bend light around them. "This is a reality distortion field generator," she announced, causing several physicists in the chamber to experience what could best be described as epistemological panic. "Reality-based weapons are still somewhat experimental," Elena admitted, "because the theoretical framework for localized space-time manipulation is still being developed by our research teams. But early field tests suggest significant potential for both tactical and strategic applications." The scanning systems were now registering energy signatures that suggested the weapon could generate localized regions where the fundamental laws of physics operated according to different parameters. The implications for both offensive and defensive applications were so staggering that several species' threat assessment systems simply shut down rather than attempt to process the information. The distortion field can be configured to modify various physical constants within a limited area, Elena explained, gesturing toward the weapon's control systems. Gravitational acceleration, electromagnetic permeability, quantum interaction probabilities, all of these can be adjusted to create tactical advantages or disadvantages for opposing forces. She activated what appeared to be a demonstration mode, causing a small region of space near the weapon to shimmer with strange optical effects. Within the distortion field, light appeared to bend at impossible angles, and small objects dropped into the area fell at rates that suggested gravity was operating according to entirely different principles. "The field radius is limited to about 10 meters, Elena continued, and the power requirements are substantial. But the tactical applications are remarkable. You can create areas where enemy weapons simply don't function properly, or regions where your own equipment operates at enhanced efficiency." The demonstration ended, and Elena began methodically detaching the reality distortion device and packing it back in her bag with the same careful attention to detail she had shown throughout the proceedings. Of course, these are all specialized applications. Most human military personnel carry standard energy weapons with perhaps one or two modification modules, depending on their specific assignment. The casual dismissal of weapons that could rewrite the laws of physics as specialized applications was somehow the most unsettling thing Elena had said all day. The fact that she considered reality-manipulating devices to be routine military equipment suggested a level of technological development that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying galactic civilization. Ambassador Rodriguez spoke Logic Core 7, its electronic voice carrying harmonics that suggested extensive recalculation of threat assessment matrices. "The weapons you have demonstrated represent technologies that most galactic civilizations consider to be theoretical impossibilities. How long has your species possessed these capabilities?" Elena considered the question thoughtfully. "Well, the basic energy weapons have been standard equipment for about 30 years now. The dimensional focusing arrays were developed about 15 years ago. Temporal displacement technology is more recent, maybe 8 years since the first practical applications. The consciousness disruption and reality distortion systems are still relatively new, probably only about 3 years since they moved out of the experimental phase." The timeline she was describing represented a rate of technological advancement that defied everything the galactic community understood about civilizational development. Most species required centuries or millennia to develop such exotic technologies, if they managed to develop them at all. Humans appear to be advancing through theoretical impossibilities at a rate that suggested they were either incredibly talented or incredibly dangerous. Possibly both. Of course, Elena added, these are just the weapons systems that have been approved for general deployment. Our research and development teams are working on some really interesting projects that are still classified. The suggestion that humanity possessed even more advanced weapons that were considered too dangerous or exotic for routine military use was causing widespread system failures among the various threat assessment protocols operating throughout the station. Several species began seriously considering whether immediate evacuation might be the wisest course of action. Elena noticed the increasing agitation among the assembled delegates and frowned slightly. I should probably mention that all of these weapons systems include comprehensive safety protocols and are only deployed by properly trained personnel. We take equipment safety very seriously. What constitutes proper safety protocols for weapons that can manipulate reality itself? Asked the crystalline entity, its thought patterns shifting into configurations that suggested deep concern for the stability of existence itself. Oh, the usual things, Elena replied cheerfully. Training certification, psychological evaluation, regular equipment maintenance, and strict rules of engagement. Plus, we require all personnel to carry temporal paradox insurance, just in case. The concept of insurance coverage for accidentally rewriting history was so fundamentally alien to galactic thinking that several translation systems simply gave up and rendered it as incomprehensible human concept involving risk management and causality. Elena closed her second bag and looked around at the assembled representatives with an expression of mild curiosity. Was there anything else you'd like to see? I've also got some defensive systems and support equipment, though I suppose those might be less interesting from a demonstration standpoint. The suggestion that Elena considered reality manipulating weapons to be the routine part of her demonstration, with defensive systems being somehow less noteworthy, was causing several delegates to reconsider their entire understanding of what constituted military technology. Actually, Elena added thoughtfully, there's one more thing I should probably mention before we move on to defensive systems. Some of our weapons require specific environmental conditions to operate properly, such as, asked the first memory, though its harmonics suggested it might be regretting the question even as it asked it. Elena's expression brightened with the enthusiasm of someone about to share particularly interesting technical information. Well, some of our more advanced systems work better in environments with active quantum flux, localized gravitational anomalies, or regions of space-time that are already experiencing dimensional instability. She gestured toward the chamber around them. I noticed that this station is built around a crystallized space-time matrix, which should provide excellent conditions for demonstrating some of our more exotic equipment. Would you like to see how our weapons perform in an enhanced operational environment? The collective realization that Elena had just suggested turning their most secure and sophisticated facility into an optimal testing ground for humanity's most dangerous weapons created a moment of absolute silence that seemed to stretch across multiple dimensions. It was the kind of silence that usually preceded either enlightenment or catastrophe. And given everything they had learned about human approaches to problem solving, several delegates were beginning to suspect it might be both. The silence that followed Elena's cheerful offer to test humanity's most exotic weapons in their quantum-enhanced environment lasted precisely long enough for 47 different species to collectively realize that politely declining might be the most important diplomatic decision in galactic history. Ambassador Rodriguez, the first memory, spoke with harmonics that carried what could only be described as desperate diplomatic restraint. While we appreciate your thorough approach to weapons demonstration, perhaps it would be more appropriate to observe your defensive capabilities under standard environmental conditions. Elena nodded agreeably, though she looked slightly disappointed. That makes sense from a safety standpoint. Some of our enhanced environment weapons can be a bit unpredictable until you're familiar with their operational characteristics. The casual admission that humanity possessed weapons too unpredictable for their own military to fully understand was somehow more unsettling than anything else Elena had demonstrated. The fact that she seemed to view this as a minor technical limitation rather than a fundamental design flaw suggested an approach to weapons development that challenged basic assumptions about responsible engineering practices. Elena reached for a third container that she had been carrying, a simple metallic case that had somehow escaped the attention of the scanning systems until now. As she opened it, every sensor in the chamber focused on its contents with the kind of intensity usually reserved for analyzing potentially catastrophic threats. Human defensive systems operate on somewhat different principles than most galactic standards, Elena explained, withdrawing what appeared to be a simple metallic bracelet. Most species focus on deflecting or absorbing incoming attacks. We prefer approaches that eliminate the threat at its source. She slipped the bracelet onto her wrist with a casual motion that caused every defensive system in the chamber to suddenly shift into high alert status. The bracelet appeared to be nothing more than a simple piece of jewelry, but the quantum signatures it was generating suggested sophisticated technology operating on principles that most scanning systems couldn't quite identify. "This is a personal defense field generator," Elena announced, activating the device with a gesture so subtle that most observers missed it entirely. "It doesn't provide protection in the conventional sense. Instead, it analyzes incoming threats and eliminates them before they can reach the protected individual." The chamber's atmospheric sensors registered a strange distortion in the space around Elena, as if reality itself had become slightly more organized in her immediate vicinity. The effect was so subtle that several species only detected it through their most sophisticated scanning equipment. "The field continuously monitors local space-time for potential threats," Elena explained, gesturing toward the nearly invisible distortion surrounding her. "Projectile weapons, energy attacks, chemical agents, biological hazards, even certain types of psychological warfare, all of these are detected and neutralized before they can cause harm." To demonstrate, she withdrew a small projectile launcher from her case and fired it directly at herself. The projectile, a simple metal slug traveling at considerable velocity, simply disappeared approximately 2 meters from Elena's position, leaving no trace of its existence except for a brief shimmer in the air that suggested matter had been rapidly converted to energy at the quantum level. "The neutralization process is quite efficient," Elena continued, apparently unconcerned by the fact that she had just demonstrated defensive technology that could casually violate conservation of mass. "Threats are analyzed and eliminated using whatever method is most appropriate: molecular disintegration, dimensional displacement, temporal deflection, or quantum probability manipulation." She fired several more projectiles at herself from different angles, each one disappearing with the same casual efficiency that suggested the defensive field was treating potentially lethal attacks as minor inconveniences. The scanning systems registered energy patterns that confirmed each projectile had been completely eliminated rather than simply deflected or absorbed. "The power requirements are modest," Elena added, "because the field only activates when threats are detected. Under normal circumstances, it operates on standby power for approximately 6 months before requiring recharging." The concept of personal defensive systems that could operate continuously for months while casually eliminating any conceivable threat was causing several species to reconsider their understanding of individual survival equipment. Most galactic civilizations relied on environmental protections and social systems to ensure personal safety, rather than equipping individuals with technology that could neutralize entire military units. Elena deactivated the personal defense field and withdrew what appeared to be a larger version of the same technology, a cylindrical device about the size of a standard storage container that hummed with barely audible energy signatures. "This is an area defense projector," Elena announced, setting the device on the floor near her position. "It provides protective coverage for larger areas using the same basic principles as personal defense fields, but with enhanced range and threat assessment capabilities." She activated the device, and suddenly, every scanning system in the chamber registered a massive change in local space-time characteristics. The entire speaking circle was now surrounded by what could only be described as a region of actively hostile reality that was continuously analyzing and preparing to eliminate any potential threats. "The coverage radius is adjustable from 10 meters to approximately 1 kilometer, Elena explained, adjusting controls on the device with the casual competence of someone operating familiar equipment. "The threat assessment protocols can be configured for different operational environments: urban areas, combat zones, space stations, or planetary surfaces." To demonstrate the system's capabilities, Elena withdrew what appeared to be a military-grade explosive device from her case and activated it. The device began its detonation sequence, building toward what the scanning systems calculated would be an explosion capable of severely damaging the chamber's structural integrity. The assembled delegates had approximately 3 seconds to contemplate their mortality before the area defense projector casually eliminated the explosive device by converting it to harmless energy at the subatomic level. The process was so efficient that there wasn't even a flash of light. The potentially catastrophic weapon simply ceased to exist. The system can handle multiple simultaneous threats, Elena continued, apparently unaware that she had just caused several dozen cardiac episodes among species that possess cardiovascular systems. Energy weapons, projectile attacks, chemical weapons, biological agents, even certain forms of exotic matter manipulation. All of these can be detected and neutralized simultaneously. She demonstrated this by activating several different weapon systems at once, creating what amounted to a localized military assault against her own position. Energy beams, projectile weapons, and what appeared to be some form of molecular acid all converged on the speaking circle, only to be casually eliminated by the defensive system with the same efficiency it had shown against the single explosive device. The neutralization methods are selected automatically based on threat type and environmental conditions, Elena explained as the brief light show ended. The system's artificial intelligence analyzes each threat and chooses the most appropriate countermeasure: disintegration, dimensional displacement, temporal shunting, or reality revision. The casual mention of reality revision as a routine defensive countermeasure was causing several species to experience philosophical crisis regarding the fundamental nature of existence. The idea that human defensive systems could simply edit threatening events out of reality suggested a level of control over the universe's basic operating principles that challenge core assumptions about the nature of causality itself. Of course, Elena added thoughtfully, the system requires careful calibration to avoid eliminating things that aren't actually threats. Early prototypes had some issues with overly aggressive threat assessment. What sort of issues? Asked the Zorti delegate, though its bioluminescent patterns suggested it was already beginning to suspect the answer would be deeply unsettling. Well, Elena replied with the tone of someone discussing minor technical difficulties. The first-generation systems had a tendency to classify any form of rapid movement as a potential threat. We lost several training facilities before our engineers refined the threat assessment algorithms. The image of defensive systems so aggressive that they eliminated their own training facilities was causing several military strategists in the chamber to recalculate their understanding of acceptable operational parameters. The fact that humans had apparently refined the technology through trial and error, accepting the loss of expensive facilities as part of the development process, suggested an approach to military engineering that prioritized effectiveness over conventional safety considerations. Elena deactivated the area defense projector and withdrew yet another device from her case, this one appearing to be some sort of portable shield generator that incorporated crystalline components and what looked like miniaturized gravity manipulation systems. This is a strategic defense matrix, Elena announced, causing every delegate to suddenly become very interested in what humans might consider strategic as opposed to personal or area defensive systems. It provides protection for larger installations, starships, orbital platforms, planetary defense networks, that sort of thing. She activated the device, which immediately began projecting what appeared to be a complex holographic display showing various defensive configurations and threat assessment protocols. The display was impressive enough, but the energy signatures suggested that the device was somehow generating actual defensive effects despite being roughly the size of a briefcase. The Matrix can coordinate defensive responses across multiple dimensional phases simultaneously, Elena explained, manipulating the holographic controls with practiced familiarity. It integrates temporal shielding, quantum uncertainty barriers, and localized space-time manipulation to create defensive effects that operate across multiple levels of reality. The scanning systems registered energy patterns that suggested the device was somehow creating a pocket dimension around itself, complete with altered physical laws and enhanced defensive capabilities. The fact that humans had miniaturized this technology into portable equipment suggested engineering capabilities that defied several fundamental principles of physics. The coverage area for strategic defense applications can be quite substantial, Elena continued, adjusting the display to show defensive configurations that appeared to encompass areas measured in cubic light years. For major installations, we typically establish nested defensive zones with overlapping coverage patterns and redundant threat elimination systems. She manipulated the controls to show what appeared to be a defensive network protecting an entire star system, complete with automated threat detection protocols and response systems that could engage hostiles at interstellar distances. The scale of the defensive planning was staggering, suggesting that humans approached strategic defense as if they expected to face threats capable of attacking across galactic distances. The response time for strategic threats is usually quite good, Elena added, though obviously you need to account for relativistic delays when engaging targets at extreme range. The system's predictive algorithms can compensate for most tactical variables, but there's always some uncertainty when you're trying to eliminate threats that haven't technically arrived yet. The casual discussion of eliminating future threats was causing several species to experience temporal disorientation as they attempted to process the implications of defensive systems that could attack enemies across time as well as space. The fact that Elena seemed to consider this a routine technical challenge rather than a fundamental violation of causality was somehow more unsettling than the technology itself. Elena began methodically deactivating and packing away her defensive equipment with the same careful attention to detail she had shown throughout the demonstration. Of course, these are just the standard defensive systems. We have more specialized equipment for unusual threat scenarios, but most of that is still classified. The suggestion that humanity possessed defensive technologies too advanced or dangerous to demonstrate was causing widespread recalculation of threat assessment protocols among species that had just witnessed weapons capable of rewriting reality and defensive systems that could eliminate threats across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Ambassador, spoke the first memory, its harmonics carrying undertones of carefully controlled concern. The defensive capabilities you have demonstrated suggest technological development that exceeds anything in our historical records. How does your species approach the integration of such advanced systems? Elena considered the question thoughtfully. Integration is really the key to effective military planning, she replied. You need to ensure that your offensive and defensive systems work together seamlessly, that your equipment can operate effectively across a wide range of environmental conditions, and that your personnel are properly trained to handle both routine operations and unexpected complications. She gestured toward her various equipment cases. For example, all of our weapons systems include built-in safety protocols that prevent them from engaging targets protected by our own defensive systems. And our defensive equipment can be configured to provide enhanced operational environments for our weapons when necessary. What sort of enhanced operational environments? Asked Logic Core 7, though its electronic voice carried harmonics that suggested it might be dreading the answer. Well, Elena replied with obvious enthusiasm, some of our more advanced weapons work better in areas with high quantum flux or localized space-time distortions. Our defensive systems can generate those conditions artificially, creating tactical advantages when deployed in combination with appropriate weapons systems. She reached for another device in her case. For instance, this is a battlefield conditioning system. It modifies local space-time to optimize conditions for human military operations. The device she withdrew appeared to be relatively small, but the energy signatures it generated suggested it was capable of fundamental alterations to the basic structure of reality in the surrounding area. Elena activated it, and suddenly, the entire chamber began experiencing subtle changes in everything from gravitational orientation to the apparent flow of time. The system can accelerate local time flow for human forces while slowing it for enemy units. Elena explained as several delegates experienced the disconcerting sensation of temporal displacement. It can also modify gravitational fields to provide tactical advantages, alter electromagnetic properties to enhance weapons' effectiveness, and adjust quantum probability distributions to improve targeting accuracy. The demonstration lasted only a few seconds, but the effects were profound enough that several species required several minutes to readjust their sensory systems and cognitive processes. The fact that humans could casually manipulate the fundamental properties of space-time as a battlefield tactic was causing widespread reconsideration of what constituted advanced military technology. The conditioning effects are temporary, Elena added helpfully, usually lasting only a few hours after the system is deactivated. Though prolonged exposure can cause permanent alterations to local space-time geometry, which is why we recommend limiting deployment to areas where long-term environmental changes won't cause problems. The casual acceptance of permanent alterations to space-time as a minor operational consideration was causing several species to experience what their psychologists would later classify as existential vertigo. The idea that humans could accidentally rewrite the fundamental structure of reality while conducting routine military operations suggested a level of technological power that challenged basic assumptions about civilizational responsibility. Elena finished packing away her battlefield conditioning system and looked around at the assembled delegates with an expression of mild curiosity. Was there anything else you'd like to see? I've also got some support equipment and logistics systems, though those might be less interesting from a demonstration standpoint. The suggestion that Elena considered reality-manipulating weapons and defensive systems to be the routine part of her demonstration, with support equipment being somehow less noteworthy, was causing several delegates to reconsider their entire understanding of what constituted military infrastructure. Actually, Elena added thoughtfully, I suppose I should mention our approach to military logistics, since that's often what distinguishes amateur military forces from professional ones. Please, said the crystalline entity, its thought patterns shifting into configurations that suggested morbid curiosity about what humans might consider professional logistic support. Elena withdrew what appeared to be a simple storage container from her case, though the scanning systems immediately registered that it was somehow larger on the inside than its external dimensions suggested. This is a standard supply depot, Elena announced, causing several physics professors in the chamber to experience academic crisis. Human military doctrine emphasizes the importance of reliable supply chains, Elena explained, opening the container to reveal what appeared to be an impossibly vast storage space filled with neatly organized military equipment. We find that most military failures can be traced back to inadequate logistics support, so we've invested heavily in advanced supply management systems. The container appeared to contain enough equipment to supply a small army, despite being roughly the size of a briefcase. The spatial distortion effects were causing several species to experience vertigo as their visual systems attempted to process geometry that violated basic assumptions about three-dimensional space. The storage capacity is quite substantial, Elena continued, reaching into the container to withdraw various pieces of equipment that should not have been able to fit in the available space. We can typically store enough supplies to support a full military company for several months of extended operations. She demonstrated by unpacking what appeared to be a complete military camp, including shelter systems, power generation equipment, communication arrays, and enough food and water to support dozens of personnel for extended periods. All of this emerged from a container that external measurements suggested should have been capable of holding perhaps a few changes of clothing. The spatial expansion technology is quite reliable, Elena explained, continuing to unpack equipment with the casual efficiency of someone performing a routine task. The expanded storage space exists in a pocket dimension that's anchored to the container, so you don't have to.